In this passage, we're not going to necessarily go verse by verse. We're going to look at this chapter tonight. And so if you can bear with me, I'd like to read the whole chapter together. But I'm going to highlight on a kind of a topic. So I'm not going to teach like I normally would in the verse by verse sense, but I do want to kind of teach a topic. And I'm going to do my best to keep it brief and let you go. It's cold, it's snowy, and all that good stuff. So I'm going to try to get to the point and get on with it. Job chapter 5, verse number 1. Call now, if there be any that will answer thee. And to which of the saints wilt thou turn? Now don't forget Eliphaz is continuing his little rebuttal here of Job. For wrath killeth the foolish man, and envy slayeth the silly one. I've seen the foolish taking root, but suddenly I cursed his habitation. His children are far from safety, and they are cursed in the gate. Neither is there any to deliver them. His children, verse 5, whose harvest the hungry eateth up, and taketh it even out of the thorns, and the robber swalloweth up their substance. Although affliction cometh not forth of the dust, neither doth trouble spring out of the ground, yet man is born unto trouble as the sparks fly upward. I would seek unto God, and unto God would I commit my cause, which doeth great things and unsearchable, marvelous things without number, who giveth rain upon the earth, and sendeth waters upon the fields, to set up on high those that be low, and those which mourn may be exalted to safety. He disappointeth the devices of the crafty, so that their hands cannot perform their enterprise. He taketh the wise in their own craftiness, and the counsel of the froward is carried headlong. They meet with darkness in the daytime, and grope in the noonday as in the night. But he saveth the poor from the sword, from their mouth, and from the hand of the mighty. So the poor hath hope, and iniquity stoppeth her mouth. Behold, happy is the man whom God correcteth. Therefore despise not thou the chastening of the Almighty. For he maketh sore, and bindeth up. He woundeth, and his hands make whole. He shall deliver thee in 6 troubles, yea, in 7 there shall no evil touch thee. In famine he shall redeem thee from death, and in war from the power of the sword. Thou shalt be hid from the scourge of the tongue, neither shalt thou be afraid of destruction when it cometh. At destruction and famine thou shalt laugh, neither shalt thou be afraid of the beasts of the earth. For thou shalt be in league with the stones of the field, and the beasts of the field shall be at peace with thee. And thou shalt know that thy tabernacle shall be in peace, and thou shalt visit thy habitation, and shalt not sin. Thou shalt know also that thy seed shall be great, and thine offspring as the grass of the earth. Thou shalt come to thy grave in full age, like as a shock of corn cometh in his season. Lo, this we have searched out. We have searched it, so it is. Hear it, and know thou it for thy good. Now what you got right here is you got Eliphaz continuing his little rebuttal of Job's first complaint. So you know the story. Job obviously is a man that really outclasses us all in his walk with God. Brother Tom mentioned just a little bit ago that, some folks say that the devil don't give them as much of a hard time as the devil gives him. Well, the devil never messes with me. Well, if you're going to confess that right out, then what you might know is that you really probably aren't that close to God. Because the closer you get to God, the closer you're going to get to the devil. Here's a man who's extremely close to God, and you know how the story began. As thou considered my servant Job, that there's none like him. So God literally calls Job out to the devil. And then all this happens. Now let me say this, Job did real well until chapter 3. And from chapter 3 to chapter 37, you've got this long conversation that goes back and forth between Job, his 3 friends, and then in the end Elihu. And then God steps in chapter 38 and begins to set things straight. And don't forget, Job was doing great until chapter 3. Job was handling it all right. In all this, Job sinned not with his mouth, nor charged God foolishly. Everything had been going great. Don't forget what we already covered. The big things did not crack Job. It was when those big things happened and then time began to just play out, that weight was on his shoulders, that burden stayed on his back, And time went down the road just wearing on him day after day. And actually, we don't know how long, but we know there had been quite a period of time. And now he is really weighed down. Really, time is the greatest test, folks. You want to find out what a man's made of? Give it time. It's one thing to talk all spiritual when you first get saved. It's another thing to serve God for 20 or 30 years. It was time that cracked Job. It was time that wore him out. And I want to bring us back again. I purposely wanted to say these things, and I want to bring us back. I am not here to criticize Job. Because if it had been Mike Ragan, Satan, had thou considered my servant Mike. Yeah, man, you won't let me touch him. Yeah, he fears me and eschews evil. Yeah, I know, it's because I can't get to him. And then God went ahead and let the devil have at me like God let the devil have at Job. I promise you one thing, chapter 3 would not, we might have got to chapter 3, we probably wouldn't have even got there. If we did, chapter 3 would have been the end. But chapter 3 would have been run way forward. See, there wouldn't have been that time period in there. So I'm not busting on Job. I'm not here to criticize a man that God said, "Hast thou considered my servant? There's none like him." God loved that man. God blessed that man. God honored that man. God got that man through that thing and then blessed him even more than he was blessed before. God loved Job. God thought highly of Job. So who do I think I am to criticize Job? You understand that? See, why are you saying all that, preacher? I'm saying that not just so you and I can learn how to evaluate things properly. I'm saying it because I fear God, and I'm teaching through the book of Job, and I don't want to have the wrong attitude between me and God. When I get to heaven, I don't want him to say, "Mike, come here a second. You remember when you did the Job series? Didn't you stop for a second and think? You got up there and you're preaching against Job. I don't want God to say, "Okay, Mike, then if you can't respect what he went through, how about I let you taste it? And then let's see what you do." So let's not forget that as we look at Job, and I want to say that, and I want that out there between me and God because I fear the Lord. Amen? So Job did great until chapter 3, and then the mistake that he made. He's not Jesus Christ. He's not perfect. He's not sinless. The mistake that this great man of God made was in chapter 3, he opened his mouth and cursed his day, right? And I talked to you about that, and I want to come back and kind of circle back to that thought again from a different angle. Tonight, what I want to show you is how to spot bad advice. It's very important that you and I know what good advice is and what bad advice is. You need to learn as a Christian how to be able to spot somebody that's giving you bad advice. And the scary thing is, it's not always easy to spot. I remember years ago, my preacher saying this, "You might not know what it is, but you sure enough know what it ain't." What I'm going to show you is what it ain't tonight. And I think I'm doing you a bigger favor to show you what it ain't than I am necessarily to always show you what it is. You realize you can teach people truth, and you can give them truth. It can be clear as a bell. You can teach it as simply as possible, but some people don't get it no matter how clearly you teach it. Do you know why? It's spiritual. So a person's soul, a person's spiritual maturity, not their physical maturity, not their life experience, not their IQ, none of those things determine whether or not somebody is actually capable of grasping onto spiritual truth. Spiritual truth is something that's got a hold of and digested as the spirit grows spiritually. Brother Lentz just did have an amazing way of taking these pithy little statements. And just what I just said to you, I got from him. You might not know what it is, but you sure enough know what it ain't. He would say things like that were so much deeper than you could even realize on the surface. And he had a way of saying them where they'd stick in your brain. They just, like a little dart, just right in there, and it's just stuck in your soul, stuck in your mind. You can't forget it. But you know what? Some of that stuff's not even starting to make sense to me until more recently, and that was been 17, 18, 19 years ago. You know why? It wasn't because he wasn't giving me truth. It wasn't because the truth wasn't simple. It's because I hadn't grown. One of the greatest things he really did do for me is help me kind of nurture that ain't it. That's wrong. Something's wrong with that. That radar, that spiritual radar. I'll never forget calling him from Crown College and on the phone with him and asking him about some of the Greek classes and some of the other stuff. And he'd give me stuff. And it was just, there was radars coming up. And he'd say, you don't know what it is, but you sure enough know what it ain't. And I go, yeah, he's right. That was encouraging to me. What he was teaching me was follow your gut sometimes when it comes to spiritual things. You know what I want to show you here tonight? I want to show you how to follow your gut, but I want to show it to you from the Bible so it's not just this ambiguous feeling, this, I just got a weird feeling. You don't have to operate that way. The Bible and truth will show you how to recognize what it ain't. The first problem I want you to recognize before I get to my first it ain't is Job opened his mouth to his peers. One of the greatest things that you can do for yourself so you don't wreck your life, so you don't wind up off track, so in your times of trial, which you will all come to, listen to me, you'll all come to it sooner or later. Sooner or later, every person in this room is going to have to deal with some kind of heartbreak. Every person in this room is going to have to deal with some kind of disappointment. Every person in this room is going to have to deal with some kind of unfairness. And the problem is when we get in those situations like Job is in here and we're really having a rough go of it and we're beginning to doubt God just a little bit, now don't be over pious with me. Sooner or later, there are times when we begin to wonder, why is God doing this to me? Why is God letting this happen? I'm trying and it ain't working out right. Listen, if you've never been there, you ought to glorify God for it. But we all get there sooner or later. And can I also just mention to you, in my experience, just take this or leave it. But this is a testifying. In my experience, there have been times when something weird has hit me and nothing is wrong. Grace will say to me, like, what's your problem? I'm like, nothing, I'm fine. She'll be like, We've been married 17 years, right? 17 and a half. I've known you for 19 years. Something's wrong. Nothing, I'm fine. Come on. She knows me. She knows I have to talk, right? So she kind of pokes at me until she pops the zit, and then it all comes out, right? And you know what's the weirdest thing in the world is when I say nothing is wrong. But I'm jacked up. I can't explain it. I have no reason for it. There's no logical explanation to it. I'm just messed up. I have nothing even to complain about. Now here's the thing. Comfort yourself in that's part of being human. Amen. I'm not trying to bring you in here happy and drag you down. I'm trying to equip you and prepare you for when these things happen. It's part of being human. It happens to all of us. When somebody you love is going through that, relax. It's normal. And what they don't need to hear is, well, you should be thankful. They probably already know that. Well, here's Job. He's got a really, really good reason to be all messed up, right? And when you're in those messed up moments, whether a good reason or not, you know what you're going to probably eventually want? Some counsel. You're going to want somebody to talk to. You're going to want some help. Now, I want to say this carefully, and I promise you, my points are going to be fast. I'm going to burn through this thing. I want to balance it, though, and I want to be slow about it, because I don't want you getting the wrong message. You need help. Every one of us needs help. The Lord has showed me that I need help. No doubt about it. But you know, I get help from very select places. And I will warn you, one of the places not to get help from is your peers. There's his buddies. Those are his friends. There's Bildad and Zophar and Elihu and all this, right? And they're all sitting around him. And he opens his mouth in his trouble and he begins spewing all of his personal feelings and all of his trouble. And then they begin wanting to be his counselors. And you know what he starts getting? Bad advice. And now it doesn't just end with chapter 3 where he said some stupid things that he cursed his day and this, that. And God says, shouldn't have done that. He says, Lord, I'm sorry. And he and his father get it all straightened up and everything's fine. No, now he let it all out in his bad time, in his downtime, in his frustrated time. He poured it all out to his peers. And now what he's getting is some really rotten advice that is fueling the fire and taking his problems farther and farther down the wrong road because of who he opened his mouth to. When you're troubled, be careful who you open your mouth to, because it will compound your problems. There are safe and proper places to go to get help. But when we run our mouths to the wrong people, we make our own issues worse. And then we start getting advice from our peers. Look, I'm not against pastors who are 42 years old and been in the ministry 12 years. I'm really not. I think they're great guys. I think that's the best age, the best length, the best guys. It's a joke, guys. I know it's cold outside, but we got to warm it up a little bit in here, right? I'm kidding. But I'm definitely not against it. But to me, if I'm going through a problem at a 12-year mark, which I'm not right now, we're good. Okay, everything's fine. Let's say I hit a snag at a 12-year mark. You know what I'm not going to do? Call a guy who's at a 12-year mark. Why? Because the advice I get is going to be his opinion or his perspective. You know what I want? I want a guy who's at a 24 or a 30-year mark who can look back and say, hey, at the 12-year mark, this is what happened to me. And this is how we got through it, and this is what I learned, because I figure if at 42 I can adopt what somebody's learned at 62, are you following me? And I can get that advice and get that wisdom and pray over that thing, and that thing will click in me. I'd sure like at 42 to be processing 60-year-old information. Making sense? When you're in your problems and you start running your mouth to the wrong people, you start getting the wrong advice, and guess what? A lot of times it'll make sense. Let me show you 3 things how to spot bad advice. Number 1, your advisors will manipulate you. Look at verse 1. Call now if there be any that will answer thee, and to which of the saints wilt thou turn? Wait a minute. What are you trying to do, man? You know what he just did? He just says to Job, after Job bears his heart about his problems, he just turns on him and starts manipulating him by using the whole everybody agrees with me argument. You ever had that before? Well, everybody else thinks so too. You ever hear somebody trying to manipulate you say that to you? You know what's funny to me when people over the years have left the church? You know what's funny to me? They say, well, I was talking to some of the folks and we think, and well, other people agree with me too. They leave you this impression that there's this big problem going on in the church and that they got this huge percentage of the church that's on their side, and that unless you come under, unless you do what I'm saying, then you're wrong and a lot of people are going to be bad and everybody else is doing it. Kids, when somebody at school tells you everybody's doing it, you guys are the only ones, you're the weirdos, they're manipulating you, you're getting bad advice. Well, how come you guys are the only ones that, how come your church is the only church that, since we seem to be invading Livingston Classical Academy of late, how come your church is the only church that they're manipulating you, you're getting bad advice? You know what the problem with Amnon was? He shared what was on his mind and on his heart to his friend. He's sick and in love with his half-sister and all that stuff, you know. Oh, what's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong? He opened up to his peer, and you know what he got? Advice from his peer. And that bad advice from his peer caused deaths, including his own. Why? Because he ran his mouth. Remember Rehoboam? He goes to the old men. He says, hey, what do you guys think? They said, look, if you'll do this or that, things will be taken care of. They said, your dad really was at the end. Your dad really, according to the historians, at the end, Solomon was really putting a lot of pressure on the people and getting rich and making slaves out of them, overburdening them. And so they said, man, your dad's really made it miserable for us. Can you lighten our load? He went to the old men. They said, you lighten their load and they will forever serve you. Back off. He went to the young men. Go out there and tell them your finger will be thicker than your father's loins. He took the young men's advice, his peers' advice, and went out and did what everybody was saying he should do, all the young generation. I'm going to follow this generation because the old fogies don't know what they're talking about, and that was the end of him. If he'd have listened to the old men, he'd have got through that thing, and it would have made him feel uncomfortable. It would have scared him. It would have undermined his personal security and all the rest of that stuff, but God would have taken care of him, and he'd had a bunch of loyal people in there that would have followed him to the ends of the earth. Be careful when people manipulate you with their advice. That's not just the whole everybody's against you and everybody agrees with me thing, but look at the subtle suggestions that begin to be made when they're manipulating you. Look at verse 4. His children are far from safety. Well, what are you saying, man? I just lost my kids. You see the manipulation? Why you got to bring up kids right now? Why do you got to be like, you know my kids just died? They're insinuating that his judgment and that this is God's judgment on him. And all the way down through here, they do that with him. Whose harvest the hungry eateth up. You know I just lost everything. And taketh it out even out of the thorns. And the robber swalloweth up their substance. Although affliction, now watch this, bad advice, manipulating advice. Although affliction cometh not forth of the dust, neither doth trouble spring out of the ground, yet man is born unto trouble as the sparks fly upward. Let me ask you a question. Is that true? Verse 7, is that true? Well, sure it is. But is verse 6 true? When somebody is manipulating you, if you listen and watch closely, you will be able to discern false doctrine in what they're saying. The problem is, usually they weave good doctrine into it. So when you hear some things that are right, it's very easy then to swallow everything hook, line, and sinker. In verse number 6, he says, although affliction cometh not forth of the dust, neither doth trouble spring out of the ground. Well, you ain't been reading Genesis, have you? Because in the book of Genesis, God says it's cursed. Twice. The ground's cursed. Yeah, trouble does come out of the ground. You live in a cursed earth. Read that text over there where the witch at Endor calls up Samuel. She calls him up out of the earth. A lot of weird stuff comes up out of the earth, folks. You don't have time for the study. The word ground is an interesting study to study throughout your Bible. You'll learn some weird stuff. So here they are kind of like weaving these shots at him and this manipulation at him while they're offering him advice. Problem, with the bad advice, they will weave in the good. That's what Lucifer did with Jesus Christ when he starts quoting Bible at him. That's what he did with Eve in the beginning when he took what the Lord said and kind of got the message. And that's what they'll do to you when the devil's trying to mess you up in your bad times. They'll come across with manipulation. A manipulative leader is not a good leader. Number 2, they'll make themselves over-spiritual if they're offering you bad advice. Watch. First of all, they're claiming verses they've never had to live through. Verse 8, I would seek unto God, and unto God would I commit my cause. How do you know what you do? When you're getting bad advice, somebody will walk up to you when you're grieving over a lost loved one, and they've never lost a loved one, and they'll say, well, Romans 8:28. All things work together for good, brother. Well, without faith, it's impossible to please him. Just don't lose your faith when you're losing your faith. Because they've never been through anything that would cause them to lose their faith. Bad advice. You mean I can quote Bible verses and it'd be bad? Yes, don't forget that when somebody else is going through a hard time, you can go quoting Bible verses at them and be used of the devil while you're quoting Bible verses. Why? You ain't never walked a mile in their shoes, man. You don't know what it's like. Don't come in here preaching at me when you're just acting all pious and acting all spiritual, and you've never been there. They'll quote a bunch of facts about God while they don't even really know him. The man they're talking to has forgotten more about God than they've ever learned. And here they are rattling a bunch of stats and facts about the Lord. You realize just because somebody can rattle a bunch of facts off about God does not mean that he knows them? Look at verse 9. Which doeth great things and unsearchable, marvelous things without number. Yeah, right, we know that. So what's that got to do with my situation? Who giveth rain upon the earth and sendeth waters upon the fields? Well, duh. I knew that before kindergarten. To set up on high those that be low, and those that which mourn may be exalted to safety. Yeah, I get it. I had pride goeth before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall, memorized probably before I knew my alphabet. I know. Well, brother, the reason is, shut up. Why do you talk like that, preacher? Because I don't believe in faking spirituality. And when you get around somebody and you sense, number one, they're manipulating you. There's a couple ways to see it from the passage, and there's more ways they can do it, but just a couple from the passage you've already showed tonight for the sake of time. And number two, you sense that they're acting overly spiritual. That ought to be a red flag. I'm not saying write them off. I'm just saying when somebody starts acting overly spiritual, it's a red flag to me. You know why? I'll tell you why. I believe that I've known a few truly spiritual men in my life. And you know, I really didn't know they were truly spiritual men until I got to know them for a long period of time. Because some of the most spiritual men that I've ever met in my life are rough as a cob, tell it straight, and then you get to know them and you come to find out they got a heart that's just pure, absolute mush. But they're soldiers, so you can't tell by looking at them. I'll just call it out, and I'm just going to call it out. I just feel like I should. And I say, Brother Joe Hicks, from what I know of him, has probably got a larger heart than all of us in this room put together. Amen. And the guy, when you try to talk to him, could care less about schmoozing you, politicking with you. He'll walk right away from you while you're talking. You have to ask him 3 or 4 times. He'll chew your face off before you go down the street. Now listen, guys, I love these people. Don't go out here and be jerks to them. And I'm standing like, well, I'm the pastor. I love these guys, and they're sacrificing their night to go out and be jerks to them. And then I'm like, no, that was good. That was good. That guy loves his people out there on the street, and he loves people that literally can't ever do anything back for him. He just loves them where they're at. They have spent 40-something years, 43 years, I think, in that latest paper out there, ripping his heart out. And he still goes out there and still loves them. Now, you know what? That's a spiritual guy. Out there in his camo cargo pants and his t-shirt and his stocking caps and his blue jeans, not strutting around church in a 3-piece suit and with the big old Bible, always having to show off and talk spiritual. He don't come across like he's some kind of a high and mighty holy roller, but the guy's got a heart of mush. Everything I know about him. See what I'm saying? When somebody comes across overly high-rolling, overly spiritual, righteous over much, like Ecclesiastes warns us about, let that be just a little bit of a red flag to you. Don't just jump on board and start taking their advice because they claim to be spiritual or seem to be sweet. Satan himself has a silver tongue. Do you hear me? Satan himself has a silver tongue. The power he's got, man, if he knocked on your door on Halloween night and said, why don't you and your wife go out for a date, I'll watch the kids, you'd have perfect peace and be totally comfortable. The sweetest guy, the best guy, the cleanest cut guy on the planet just showed up, and he's going to watch the kids while we go out for a date. And he's Lucifer. A little more to this thing than putting on. And some of the most wicked people put on spirituality. Amen. That's good preaching. Thank you. I appreciate it. But making themselves over spiritual, one of the things they'll do is they'll claim verses they've never lived. Another thing they'll do is they'll quote a bunch of facts about God at you as though you don't know. Another thing they'll do is they'll kick you while you're down. Look at verse 17. Behold, happy is the man whom God correcteth. Therefore despise not thou the chastening of the Almighty. Excuse me? That's bad advice. What do you mean that's bad advice? He said the right thing. Yeah, I know he said the right thing, but like last time we talked about having knowledge without wisdom, the guy had knowledge without wisdom. So he's saying don't despise the chastening of the Almighty, but why was it bad advice? The Almighty wasn't chastening him. Who was chastening him? You know what that man just accidentally did without knowing it? Getting kind of heavy, ain't it? You walk up to some other Christian who's going through a hard time and you start trying to give them advice when you don't know what you're talking about. Don't despise the chastening. Brother, you shouldn't be acting like that. What? He hasn't cussed God. He cursed the day he was born. He hasn't been saying things about God that you go, oh, wait a minute. He's just questioning why. He hasn't gone off the deep end here. And here you are saying, oh, brother, don't despise the chastening of the Lord. How do you know God's chastening him? You don't. And so what will happen when you're going through a hard time? It might be the devil busting you up. It might not be the Lord. And somebody will come along, don't despise the chastening of the Lord. He'll go, yeah, I am. I'm such a terrible Christian. I'm despising the chastening. And the devil just keeps working his way in there, working his way in there, working his way in there, into your mind, into your heart. And he's going to try to rot your soul, man. He's going to try to make you bitter, make you quit on God, make you run from the Lord. Why? Bad advice. I'm almost done. Last way you'll be able to spot somebody with bad advice. They'll miss the obvious. Watch. Look at verse 21. Thou shalt be hid from the scourge of the tongue. Huh? Does anybody see where this guy's missing the obvious? He's talking about himself. Thou shalt be hid from the scourge of the tongue. Despise not the chastening of the Almighty. Dude, if you're trying to encourage me here, and you're trying to tell me that God's going to bring me through this, and that it's all going to be all right, and if you look at the whole passage, you can look at it later for the sake of time. I'm just trying to give you some stuff that might help a little bit. If you go back and look at it, you'll see that, it looks like maybe he thinks Job is going to come out of this fine and God is going to bless him because he knows Job's testimony. Maybe he thinks Job is really being judged and beat up for doing wrong. It's like back and forth the whole time, and you can't ever really, there's no authority there. You can't ever really figure out where he's coming from or what he was just trying to, what was he just trying to say? Right? You're not forthright and honest. And it's like he's saying, thou shalt be hid from the scourge of the tongue, and yet his tongue half the time is adding to Job's pain. Listen. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, right? But the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. If I have to tell you something negative, I'm not going to mess around with you. I'm not going to be overly righteous with you. I'm not going to manipulate you. I'm going to say, hey, I need to talk to you a minute. And then it might hurt, but I'm a friend. This guy is guilty of what he's just telling him God's going to hide him from. You ever have somebody try to give you advice? They're trying to preach at you about how you need to discipline your kids, and their kids are over out back, smoking a crack rock and setting the church on fire. They're missing the obvious. They're trying to tell you what you need to do in your spiritual life, and they're over there, they got their own, they got a big old lump of chewing tobacco in their mouth, and they're, you really should quit smoking. It's really bad for you, and it's a bad testimony. You're like, okay, dude, appreciate your help. Bad advice. Not good advice. How about gossiping about somebody who's envious? How about gossiping about somebody who's not in church? How about envying somebody else because they're stuck up and proud and got so much going on in their life, and look at them, they're so stuck, they think so much of themselves. We miss the obvious sometimes, don't we? Overlooking the fact that you don't know someone else's heart. Look at verse 24. Thou shalt know that thy tabernacle shall be in peace, and thou shalt visit thy habitation, and shalt not sin. All right? Well, in all this, Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. And there they are trying to tell him how to do right, when they're the ones sinning and he's the one doing right. Bad advice. In conclusion, I want you to remember this in your trials. Be careful what you say. Be careful who you say it to. I've learned this the hard way. My wife's learned this the hard way. I try now, when I'm going through a hard time, to clam up. Not to internalize. I clam up. You know why? More than once I've gone, hey man, I'm having a hard time. I go to a brother, I try to start talking to that brother, and then what's coming out of my mouth, what he hears is the frustration. What he hears is the pain. What he hears is the bitterness. What he hears is the tail end of that struggle. What he can't see, because he's human, is all the history that led up to that point. And so now what is coming out of my mouth probably isn't exactly right. Sometimes things come out of my mouth that's not. I know I'm not all, preachy tonight, but I hope this makes sense to you. Sometimes things come out of my mouth that should not come out of my mouth. You've been around here any length of time, you've heard me say some things I shouldn't have said. I hate that. But when they come out of my mouth at the wrong time to the wrong person, and then they start wanting to, quote unquote, help me, you know what happens to my problems? They get much bigger. And I struggle with handling that bigger problem right because it just added on top to what I'm already frustrated about. The infection spreading. Watch what you say. Watch who you say it to. I've had a couple of men that knew how to counsel me. And you know what I noticed about them? They never jumped to conclusions. They never were too fast to make a decision. They always asked me lots of questions. They learned how to dig. And trust me, bro, you ain't digging on me. You ain't asking me lots of questions, and you ain't getting anywhere if I don't think you're going to give me good, biblical, spirit-filled advice, and you're not my friend truly intending to help me. Be careful what you say. Be careful who you say it to. And be careful who you listen to. Because the devil will make sure that when you're not doing well spiritually, somebody comes along to give you some bad advice. Now remember this and we're done. Look at verse 19. He shall deliver thee in 6 troubles, yea, in 7 there shall no evil touch thee. Now look down at verse 26. Thou shalt come to thy grave in full age, like as a shock of corn cometh in his season. Remember in your troubles, no matter what kind of advice you get, remember, God isn't done yet. Does God wind up delivering Job? Yes. Does Job get to live a good long life and get over the sickness he has? Yes. So in spite of what this jackleg is saying, God's got it under control. In spite of the fact that Job maybe shouldn't open his mouth, God loves him and God's going to take care of him. So be careful when you're going through hard times not to take bad advice. You might not know what it is, but you sure enough know what it ain't.